She was 3 years old, and she was committing what would turn out to be the most consequential act of kindness in that entire house's history. Her name was Kieran. She was holding a watercolor brush loaded with yellow paint, and she was leaning forward with the focused, unhurried concentration of a surgeon, studying the sleeping face of one of the wealthiest men in South Korea. He didn't know she was there. He didn't know what she was doing. And by the time he found out, nothing would ever be quite the same again. She started with the sun, left cheek, small and careful, its edges bleeding softly the way watercolor edges always did, which Kieran had privately decided was simply how real suns looked up close. Not sharp, but warm and slightly imprecise like something alive. She examined it for a moment, tilted her head, then moved on. 3 stars along his jaw, because 3 felt like the correct number. A flower just above his brow with petals that leaned slightly sideways, the way flowers leaned when wind passed through them. And then the thing she had been saving her best blue for, a small bird across the bridge of his nose, wings spread fully open, painted in the color of sky directly after rain. She leaned back and studied the complete picture with the critical eye of someone who took her work seriously. The bird's right wing needed one more stroke. She was almost certain. She had just raised the brush again when the door opened. Her mother walked in carrying a tray, looked at the sofa, looked at her daughter, looked at the wet brush suspended in Kieran's small hand. The tray stayed level through what could only have been a significant act of will. Kieran looked up at her mother with the uncomplicated calm of someone who has done a thoroughly good thing. He had a sad face, she said simply. So I gave him a sky. Her mother could not speak. She stood in the doorway of that sitting room on a gray November morning in Seoul, holding a tray she had forgotten she was carrying, looking at a man who controlled more wealth than she would see in 10 lifetimes, asleep on a cushioned bench with watercolor stars drying along his jaw and a tiny blue bird across his nose. And her 3-year-old daughter sitting cross-legged on the floor beside him, brush in hand, completely satisfied. To understand how any of this was possible, how a 3-year-old with a paintbrush ended up cracking open the most guarded man in the room, you have to go back 6 weeks. To a Tuesday morning in October when everything that followed was set quietly, unknowingly into motion. Kang Jae-won was 29 years old, the youngest self-made billionaire in South Korea's real estate sector, and he had survived every kind of betrayal that wealth attracts. Business rivals who toasted him at dinner and filed injunctions by morning. A woman he had genuinely loved who sold his most private grief to a journalist for less money than he spent on a single meal. A mentor, a man he had called a second father, who redirected a 12 billion won contract into his own firm and looked Jae-won in the eye at the next board meeting without a trace of shame. He had survived all of it, not by becoming hard, by becoming invisible inside himself. From the outside, his life looked like everything anyone could want. A 4-story modernist residence perched in the hills above Songbuk-dong, all clean angles and floor-to-ceiling glass that caught the Seoul skyline like a painting that shifted with every hour. A private garden that bloomed on schedule whether or not anyone walked through it. A chef, a security team, a household staff that rotated through his life with professional efficiency. Beautiful, immaculate, and on most mornings, so quiet it rang. He told himself he preferred it that way. He had learned early that people showed you exactly who they were the moment they believed no one was paying attention. So Jae-won paid attention. Always. He ran quiet tests on the people around him the way a structural engineer stress tests a bridge. Not from cruelty, but because he had placed real weight on people before and felt the collapse. And he had decided, somewhere between the mentor and the woman and the business partner, that the cost of that was too high to keep paying. He was not lonely. He was simply careful. He told himself that often enough that most days he believed it. The woman who arrived on that Tuesday morning in mid-October came through a placement agency in Mapogu. Her name was Claire Adeyemi, 34, originally from Lagos, Nigeria. She had come to Seoul 6 years earlier on a corporate relocation with the communications firm she worked for at the time, fallen in love with the city's particular rhythm, the way it moved fast and quiet at the same time, the way it held ancient and modern in the same breath, and stayed long after the job contract ended and the marriage that had grown alongside it slowly came apart at the seams. Lagos had raised her to be many things. Adaptable, tenacious, unafraid of starting over. The city of her childhood had taught her that the world does not wait and does not apologize, and that the only reasonable response to either fact is to keep moving forward. So she had. She rebuilt herself and soul with the kind of focused, unhurried determination that does not make noise but does not stop either. She spoke Korean fluently with a slight, warm accent she had long stopped trying to erase. She was meticulous, composed, and arrived 12 minutes early to everything. She asked one clarifying question before starting work and did not ask another for the rest of the day. What the agency file had not included, what Jae-won discovered the moment she appeared at his front entrance that Tuesday morning, was the child, 3 years old, standing beside her mother with a stuffed elephant tucked under one arm and an expression of absolute calm that most adults spend entire lifetimes trying to cultivate. She wore a green puffer jacket 2 sizes too large for a small frame and regarded the 4-story glass house in front of her the way seasoned travelers regard airports. Mildly interesting, nothing to fear. Her name was Kieran. Claire explained the situation immediately, clearly, without dressing it up. Her childcare arrangement had collapsed that morning. A family emergency. She had no one else. She could reschedule if needed, she said, but she wanted to flag it rather than simply not show up. Jae-won looked at the child. Kieran looked back at him, unhurried, unimpressed, like she was the one deciding whether he was worth her time. He stepped aside from the doorway. "Come in," he said. Claire exhaled once, quickly, then guided Kieran through the door. Kieran's first act was to crouch and press both palms flat against the polished concrete floor as if testing whether it could be trusted. Her second was to tilt her head back and study the vaulted ceiling with quiet authority before delivering her verdict to her elephant. "Big," she said. Her third act was to locate the far corner of the sitting room, lower herself to the floor, and begin unpacking her bag with the focused seriousness of someone setting up a workstation. Sketchbook, colored pencils arranged by some private system of logic. Elephant positioned at a useful angle. One bruised tangerine set aside for later. Then she began drawing and did not look up again. Jae-won returned to his study. He did not close the door completely. He told himself it was the light. The angle was better with it open slightly. From down the hall came no noise worth noting. Kieran was not the kind of child who required the room to know she existed. She hummed sometimes, low and tuneless, clearly not for anyone's benefit. Occasionally, there was a murmured exchange with the elephant about some creative disagreement. Once, a single soft sound of frustration when a drawing didn't cooperate, followed by silence, followed by what Jae-won could only interpret as the sound of a 3-year-old deciding to start over without making it anyone else's problem. He found his concentration drifting toward the hallway more than once. He did not examine why. Over the following weeks, the childcare situation became a recurring disruption. The arrangement would stabilize, then unravel again. Each time Claire called ahead. Each time she had already identified a potential solution before presenting the problem. Each time Jae-won said bring her, and returned to his desk faintly unsettled by how easily the words came. A quiet routine took shape without anyone naming it. Kieran arrived, claimed her corner, unpacked with ceremony, and worked in self-sufficient silence. Claire moved through the house with her usual focused efficiency. Jae-won worked behind his half-open door. And occasionally, with no particular purpose, he would take the longer route between rooms, the one that curved past the sitting room entrance, and not quite stop but slowed down slightly. On the third of these non-stops, Kieran looked up from her sketchbook. "You have a very tall house," she said. "Not odd, just noting a fact." "I do," he agreed. A pause while she studied him with those serious, measuring eyes. "Do you live here by yourself?" "Yes." She considered this with the gravity it apparently deserved. Then she went back to her drawing without offering any opinion on the matter, which somehow felt more pointed than if she had. He began leaving a small glass of barley tea near her corner each morning. He didn't note when this started. He didn't question it. It was simply a thing that happened. Kieran always received it with both hands wrapped around the glass and the air of someone participating in an important ritual. Claire noticed. She was careful not to let him see that she noticed. But Jae-won had spent years reading the small things people tried to keep off their faces, and what he saw in Claire's expression when she thought he wasn't looking was something he didn't quite know what to do with. It wasn't gratitude exactly. It was closer to recognition. like she was watching a door that had been locked for a very long time shift slightly on its hinges. The morning that everything finally broke open arrived on a Thursday in November. Seoul had turned cold the way it does that month. Abruptly, completely, as though the city had simply decided warmth was finished and moved on. The garden below the glass panels had gone skeletal overnight. The light was pale and flat, the kind that makes everything feel slower and more considered. J1 had a full schedule, board call at 11, a contractor review mid-afternoon, and a private dinner that evening with 3 investors he had been managing carefully for the better part of a year. Important people. The dinner had to be flawless. He reviewed the evening's arrangements with Claire at 7:30. She had been there since before 6, working through the preparation list with characteristic thoroughness, and had already anticipated 2 adjustments he was about to suggest before he made them. He noted that without commenting on it. Kieran was in her corner with a new set of watercolors. A real set, Claire mentioned quietly, sent from her mother back in Lagos. 8 pigment squares, a collapsible brush, a small ceramic mixing dish. Not a children's toy. The real thing, chosen by a grandmother who understood that her granddaughter took her work seriously. The morning moved through its schedule. The board call ran efficiently. The contractor review migrated to a video call. The rain began against the windows in the way November rain does in Seoul. Patient, gray, without drama. J1 found himself working from the sitting room rather than his study. The long glass panels faced the garden, and the overcast sky gave the room a quality he couldn't name but didn't want to leave. He settled at the far end with his laptop. Kieran was at her corner on the opposite side, brush moving in careful silence. They occupied the space the way they had learned to, in parallel, without friction, each absorbed in their own work, the room between them neither empty nor crowded. He finished his last call 35 minutes ahead of schedule. He set the laptop on the cushion beside him. Outside, the rain had softened to something barely audible. The garden was gray and still. The room was warm. The silence had a texture to it that was different from the silence he usually lived inside. That one was the silence of a space waiting to be filled. This one felt like something that had, without him noticing the exact moment it happened, already arrived. He leaned back. He closed his eyes. And Kong Jaewon, a man who had not fully let his guard down in the presence of another living person in longer than he could honestly remember, fell asleep. Genuinely, unguardedly, completely asleep. Kieran's brush stopped moving. She looked at him across the room. His face in sleep was something she had not seen before. All the angles of it had softened. The watchfulness he carried, even when he was still, that permanent quiet alertness, was gone. What remained was something much quieter. Something that looked, to a 3-year-old who understood more than she had words for, like a person who was very tired in a place much deeper than sleep could reach. She tilted her head. She looked at her watercolors. The yellow, the soft blue, the small amount of rose pink she had been saving because it felt too precious to use on just anything. She looked back at his face, at the November light falling across his cheekbone, at the faint crease between his brows that hadn't fully released even now. She made her decision in the quiet, absolute way that children make decisions when they are certain they are doing something kind. She wet her brush, and that was where we came in. Claire set the tray down on the near surface before she dropped it. Her hands were not entirely steady. She crossed the room and measured steps, crouched beside Kieran, and spoke in the low, careful voice she used when the situation required calm that she did not fully feel. "Baby," she said, "we have to wake him up." Kieran looked at her with those grave, considering eyes. "Will he be angry?" Claire looked at the man on the sofa, at the stars along his jaw, at the small sun on his cheek, at the blue bird she had to admit was remarkably well executed for someone who had been alive for 38 months. She genuinely did not know the answer to her daughter's question. What she knew was this. She had rebuilt her life once already from nothing, in a city that was not her own, in a language she had stitched together word by word over 6 careful years. Lagos had raised her to be resilient, to plant her feet and adapt, and keep building regardless of what the ground beneath her decided to do. But it had not prepared her for standing in a Seoul billionaire's sitting room, watching her daughter's watercolor birds dry on his face. Some situations existed entirely outside of preparation. The most stable thing she had managed to build in the past 8 months was this job, this house, This carefully maintained professional relationship with a man who did not give trust easily and whose respect she had earned through consistency and competence and the kind of quiet reliability that speaks louder than any interview ever could. And her daughter had painted stars on his jaw. She reached out and touched Jae-won's shoulder gently. His eyes opened. He looked at Claire. He looked at Kieran. He read the expression on both their faces, Claire's controlled, careful stillness and Kieran's watchful sincerity, and understood immediately that something had happened, without yet knowing what. He felt it a moment later, something cool and faintly damp along his jaw. He raised his hand and touched his cheek, looked at his fingers. Yellow. He sat up slowly. Mr. Kong, Claire said, and her voice was steady in the way that caused something. I owe you an apology. I should have been in the room. Kieran didn't understand. She's 3 years old, and she meant no harm, and I take full responsibility for this. If you need us to leave today, I understand completely. She meant it, every word, and she wasn't asking for anything. She was simply being honest in the way that people are honest when they have nothing left to bargain with. Jae-won looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Kieran. Kieran stood up from the floor and walked directly to him, which was either remarkable courage or the complete absence of self-preservation instinct, and looked up at his face from approximately half a meter away with those enormous, serious eyes. I painted you, she said, because you looked sad when you were sleeping. A brief pause. You have a sad face when you sleep, she added, as though this was important information he deserved to have. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood, moved into the hallway, and stopped in front of the mirror. What he saw stopped him completely. A sun on his left cheek, its edges soft and slightly uneven. Stars along his jaw, 3 of them careful and deliberate. A flower above his brow with petals that tilted like they were catching wind. And across the bridge of his nose, a small blue bird with its wings spread fully open, painted in a color that was, and he registered this with something he couldn't immediately name, exactly the shade of sky that appears after a long rain. He stood there for a long time, long enough that Claire, watching from the sitting room doorway, felt her breath go shallow. She had worked for wealthy people before, in Lagos and briefly in London before Seoul. She knew that this moment could resolve in a dozen different directions, most of them professional endings. She had prepared herself, in the 30 seconds since he had walked to that mirror, for the version of Kong Jae-won who would turn around composed and cold and quietly ask them to leave. She had not prepared herself for what actually happened. He didn't turn around cold. He turned around with his eyes full of tears, not spilling over, just full. The way eyes look when something has reached a place that hasn't been reached in a very long time and the body doesn't quite know yet how to process the arrival. He looked at Kieran. You said I had a sad face, he said quietly. Kieran nodded, completely serious. You did, and you painted me a sky and a bird, she said, pointing helpfully toward his nose. Because birds make things better. Something shifted in his face, something deep and structural, the way a building shifts when a load-bearing element finally gives, not a collapse, but a settling. The thing it had been braced against for years, quietly, exhaustingly, finally allowed to put itself down. He sat back down on the bench. He put his face in his hands. And then, and Claire would think about this moment for a long time afterward, would turn it over the way you turn over something rare that you're still not sure you fully understand. He laughed. Not a polished laugh. Not the controlled, measured laugh she had occasionally heard from his study at the end of a successful call. This was something else entirely. This came from somewhere unguarded and deep and had tears threaded through it. The kind of laugh that sounds less like amusement and more like a door flying open after years of being locked from the inside. Kieran burst into laughter immediately because she was 3 years old and laughter was simply contagious, and she clapped her paint-stained hands together with uncomplicated delight. Claire stood in the doorway with one hand pressed over her mouth and tears moving silently down her face. She couldn't have explained precisely why she was crying. She only knew that she was watching something real happen, and that real things, when you had spent long enough surrounded by careful surfaces, had a particular way of landing. Jae-won lifted his head. His face was open in a way she had not seen it in the 8 months she had worked inside this house. The watchfulness was gone. What remained was something younger. Something that looked like a person who had just remembered dimly and with some surprise. who he had been before he became so focused on protecting himself from everything that had the potential to matter. He looked at Kieran. "You know what?" he said. "I think this might be the best I've looked in a long time." Kieran examined him with professional objectivity. "I know," she agreed. "The bird was a good idea." He laughed again, softer. Then he looked at Claire, and when he spoke his voice had lost the particular quality it usually carried, that slight, ever-present distance, like a pane of glass installed permanently between himself and everyone else in the room. "Don't apologize," he said. "Please. There's nothing to apologize for." Claire nodded once. She didn't trust herself to speak. He kept the painting on his face for 2 hours. He took a call with a contractor. He reviewed the evening's menu adjustments with his chef. He sat in his study with watercolor stars along his jaw and a blue bird across his nose and did not explain himself to anyone. When one of his advisors joined a video call and paused visibly at the sight of him, Juan simply said, "I had an interesting morning," and moved on to the agenda. When he finally washed it off before the dinner, he stood at the bathroom sink and watched the colors thin and spiral down the drain. The yellow sun, the careful stars, the flower, the bird, last of all, its wings dissolving slowly in the water until there was nothing left of it. He stood there longer than was necessary. Something had come off with the paint, and something else had not. The careful architecture he had spent years constructing inside himself, all those walls, all that managed distance, had developed, in the space of one gray November morning, a crack that he already understood was not going to close. He wasn't sure he wanted it to. In the days that followed, the house felt different. Not in any way that could be pointed at directly. The rooms were the same. The schedule was the same. But J1's office door stayed fully open now. And he said good morning to Claire like he meant it. And sometimes in the late afternoon, he would come to the sitting room doorway and simply watch Kieran paint for a moment without announcing himself, the way a person lingers near something warm. He began asking Claire questions. Small ones at first. How long she had been in Seoul. What Kieran's favorite color was this week, because it apparently changed with some regularity. What made Kieran laugh hardest? What she was afraid of, if anything, which turned out to be surprisingly few things for someone her size. Claire answered carefully in the beginning, the way she had learned to be careful with people who held power over circumstances she needed to protect. But J1's curiosity had a quality she hadn't encountered much before. It didn't feel extractive. It felt genuine, like he was asking because he actually wanted to know, not because knowing gave him something useful. Gradually, she began to answer with more of the truth. She told him about Lagos, about growing up in a city that never fully slept, where the energy on the street at midnight felt the same as the energy at noon, where people negotiated and hustled and celebrated with a volume and aliveness that she had spent years quietly missing since leaving. About her mother, who still sent voice notes every Sunday morning. Long, unhurried recordings full of neighborhood news and cooking instructions and the particular blend of affection and gentle pressure that Lagos mothers have perfected across generations. About the years of building something here in Seoul, learning to belong to a city that had not been built with her in mind, but that had led her in any way, slowly and on its own terms. About the marriage that had gradually become a space two people occupied without truly inhabiting, and the quiet morning she had finally understood that leaving was the more honest choice. She told him that some mornings were genuinely hard, not in a way that required anything from him, just honestly. He listened in a way she was not accustomed to, without his phone, without the slight forward lean of a person preparing their response. He simply listened. And when she finished, he didn't immediately fill the space, which was its own kind of rare. One afternoon, with Kieran painting at the coffee table between them and the winter light coming low and gold through the garden glass, J1 said something he had not said to another person in years. He said it sideways, the way people say things they are not practiced at saying, wrapped inside a story about his father and the early years of building the business. About how the drive to protect what he'd built had somewhere along the way become indistinguishable from the drive to keep everything at arm's length. About how he had confused safety with solitude for so long that he had stopped noticing the difference. He didn't call it loneliness. He didn't need to. Claire was quiet for a moment after he finished. Then she said, "I know that feeling. I really do. Just that. Nothing added to it. No advice. No attempt to resolve it or reframe it into something easier to carry. And somehow those 5 words, said simply and without performance, were exactly right. The dinner that evening was a success. 2 of the 3 investors committed before dessert arrived. The third signed a preliminary agreement 3 days later. It was the culmination of 8 months of careful, patient work and should have been the defining moment of that week. Jawan would say later, to no one in particular, that it wasn't. What came after was quiet and without announcement. Claire's contract was renewed, and the terms of it reflected what her work was actually worth rather than what an agency's standard bracket suggested. A room on the ground floor, small, south-facing, full of winter light, was converted over the course of a single weekend. An art table at the right height. A supply cabinet stocked with paper and pigments and brushes in every size. A small ceramic jar of barley tea placed near the window where the morning light would hit it first. J1 did not mention it to Claire. He did not frame it as a gesture or wait to be thanked. He simply made sure it was there. The morning they arrived and Kieran found it, she stood completely still in the doorway for a long time. Long enough that Claire came to see what had stopped her. Kieran walked slowly into the room. She touched the edge of the art table with 2 fingers. She looked at the brushes arranged in their jar. She turned around and looked up at Jawan, who was standing in the hallway behind them both, and her face held an expression that was far too large for a 3-year-old's features to fully contain. "Is this for me?" she asked, in a voice that had gone very small. Jawan crouched down to her level. "It's for the bird," he said. "She needs a proper place to work." Kieran looked at him for one more second. Then she walked forward and wrapped both arms around his neck and held on with the total, unqualified commitment that small children bring to hugs, as though the only acceptable version is the kind that uses everything you have. Jawan stayed very still, his eyes closed, and in the quiet of that south-facing room in his enormous, beautiful, finally no longer empty house, something that had been sealed for a very long time simply opened. Not with drama, not with effort, the way a window opens when someone finally remembers to unlatch it. He had spent years running tests on people, watching for fractures, waiting for the moment they revealed themselves as something less than what they claimed to be. He had never once considered that the person who would finally pass every test he hadn't known he was giving would be 3 years old, armed with a set of watercolors her grandmother had sent from Lagos, and completely uninterested in the fact that he was worth billions. Kieran had not seen his wealth. She had not seen his reputation or his walls or the careful architecture of a man who had decided that distance was safer than connection. She had looked at his sleeping face on a gray November morning and seen exactly one thing. Someone who needed a sky, and without hesitation, without strategy, without asking for anything in return, she had given him one. Sometimes the walls we build to protect ourselves become the very thing that imprisons us. We survive betrayal by becoming careful, and we become so careful that we forget what it felt like to simply be known. We mistake control for safety and solitude for strength. And we keep the door locked so long that we forget there was ever anything on the other side worth opening it for. And then something finds a crack, not through force, not through strategy, through a small hand, a wet brush, and the absolute certainty of a child who looked at a guarded man's sleeping face and decided, he needs more color. That is all it took. That is sometimes all it ever takes.
And that is the end of today's story, guys. As you all know, the stories told on this channel are not just for entertainment purposes only, they are for educational value as well. So the moral lesson of today's story is that sometimes the greatest wounds cannot be healed by wealth, success, or power. They are healed by simple acts of genuine kindness. We often build walls around our hearts to protect ourselves from pain, only to discover that those same walls keep out love, joy, and meaningful connections. Kang Ji-woon's life was not changed by money or business success. It was changed by the innocent compassion of a little girl who saw past his status and simply noticed that he looked sad. Her kindness reminded him that healing begins when someone truly sees you. And that is the moral lesson of today's story. Thank you all for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share.